You all know John Mearsheimer, probably. Early on in the U.S. led proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, John Mearsheimer was going viral. He was someone who is considered, he's an academic. He works at the University of Chicago. He's a distinguished professor of international relations there. And he's considered this like realist scholar. And his position went viral. And it was a very simple position. It was that the United States, that the West was actually primarily responsible for what was happening as of February 2022 with regard to Ukraine, because it was the United States and the West which sponsored a coup in 2014, and even before that in 2008 flirted with NATO. So Ukraine had been destabilized in 2014. There had been aims to integrate Ukraine into NATO since 2008, and that over the last 8 years, it was the West that was fomenting, that was escalating, and that was provoking Russia into now this current conflict, which we are now more than 9 months in the making, entering month 10. And boy, are things getting hot. I'll see if I have time to do a Ukraine update at the end, but I may not have time tonight. But nonetheless, we're talking about John Mearsheimer, at least for the time being. And he's someone that I was never too impressed with. Yes, it's great when an academic can say something true, something real about imperialism. We get it so very rarely. Most of the time, mainstream Western academia is carrying water for the war machine. That's what it's doing. That's what it primarily does. However, you know, John Mearsheimer has a very contradictory position that I wanted to talk about, because this is a blind spot that a lot of people actually have in the West in general. For those who are very critical of the US's aggressive posture toward Russia, who believe what's happening in Ukraine is a proxy war, a literal US provocation to draw Russia into Ukraine so that it can work on conducting regime change in Moscow by weakening Russia through this proxy war. For those who believe that, there are a lot of people in that camp who also believe that China is a literal threat, quote unquote threat, who believe that while Russia isn't a threat, China is a threat. And I think this is a huge problem that we are facing right now, because it distorts the reality of the situation that the US, through NATO and through its so-called allies and through its imperialist alliances and military escalations and all of the policies that it has abroad, that its foreign policy, it's all geared toward waging a two-front war, to getting to the point where Russia and China are attacked together, right? That they are being fought together. And I want to play you a recent interview. And I'm going to start a recent interview that John Mearsheimer did, because I think what it shows is that this blind spot is deeper than we think. And he actually says it very profoundly and clearly why this is the case. And I'll tell you why this is the case, that this blind spot exists. It's because you have a section of the ruling elite which has successfully propagandized others into believing that Russia isn't a threat, but China is. And the hope is that they can drive a wedge. There's a wedge theory that's been going on since the end of the Cold War. The Wolfowitz doctrine had this also at heart, which is to drive a wedge between Russia and China by using Russia's weakness to its advantage against China as a new Cold War kind of ramps up. That's really the point here. So let's play this interview, and we'll, you'll see what I mean here.
Let's turn our attention eastward towards what is not yet a crisis, but many people think might be a crisis on the horizon, around Taiwan and China. Learning what we've learned from this conflict, what would you like to see the West's approach to that issue be?
Well, I have a fundamentally different view on China than I do on Russia. And therefore, my thinking about Taiwan is different than my thinking about Ukraine. I believe that China is a peer competitor of the United States, and that it is a threat to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. And the United States does not tolerate other regional hegemons. We're a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. And over time, we have gone to great lengths to prevent countries like.
So there you have it. He's very clear about it from the beginning. He believes the U.S. is a regional hegemon. That's not a problem. That's not a problem. But what he believes is that China is an actual peer competitor. All that means in his speak, because this is kind of his theory, is that great powers, right, need to be identified, and that China is a great power, and that it actually is a peer competitor, meaning that it is of equal status with the United States, and thus is an actual threat. And so that's all he's saying here already, just making clear that he has no problems with the way that the United States handles its foreign policy toward China.
Like Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union from dominating either Europe or Asia. From an American point of view, that's unacceptable. And I think that's correct. I think the United States should not want China to dominate Asia the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere.
So that I mean, the propaganda, the position is clear. The United States can't, it should not want China to dominate, right? First of all, there's a lot of projection going on here. China doesn't operate in Asia like the United States operates in Latin America, for example. That's well documented and well proven. China isn't going to Malaysia, Myanmar, and any country along the South China Sea, for example. It's not saying, well, you're my backyard and I'm going to put my military installations here and I'm going to overthrow your government and install a puppet government. I'm going to support judicial coups like in Brazil. I wanted to support actual coups like in Paraguay, Honduras, right? China's not doing that. But here you still have Mearsheimer using Cold War. This is how you know he's a neoliberal. This is how you know that he's more aligned with the neocons than he is not. He is using Cold War rhetoric, saying that, well, the Soviet Union was a pure competitor and we didn't want socialism out there in Eastern Europe. So that's why we needed NATO. That's what he's really saying there, because that's why NATO formed. We need to do the same thing that we did then to China now. So he looks at China like the Soviet Union. And I got to give him credit. At the very least, he's honest. He's honest in the sense that he is such a deeply committed capitalist and neocon that he understands that at the very least, China is socialist and China is different. But here he's using propaganda to try to tell you differently, that actually China is a boogeyman and a threat. Really, this response is coming from a deep rejection of everything China is all about. And he'll get more into why he believes Russia is different. And I think this should interest anyone who is trying to navigate some pretty muddy waters when it comes to this big blind spot that people have around Russia and China.
So we're going to go to great lengths to contain China. And for purposes of containing China, it is important for us to defend Taiwan. And from a Chinese point of view, this is categorically unacceptable. Taiwan, from a Chinese point of view, is sacred territory. And the fact that the West is preventing China from reincorporating Taiwan into its body politic is a cause of anger, real anger. So what's happening here is that as the security competition between China and the United States ratchets up in East Asia, the United States becomes more committed than ever to defending Taiwan, to keeping Taiwan allied with the United States and its other allies in East Asia, infuriating the Chinese more and more. So you have this intense security competition setting in. And at the heart of that intense security competition is this potential point of conflict, Taiwan, that threatens to escalate and cause a war.
But
So this is what's hilarious about this, and the interviewer is about to get into it, is that he's almost happy about it. I mean, this is, academics can be so, how can I say, detached, right? He feels detached. He feels like he's not into this. That what he's into this more as a point of study rather than the real world consequences. So he's willing to throw out his analysis around Ukraine, right? He's willing to say, well, okay, Ukraine is a proxy war. It's the West's fault, and Russia was provoked. But with China, he's willing to just flip that and say, well, China, it's fine. The U.S. should defend Taiwan around China, even though this is going to escalate into war. So really, Mearsheimer is both saying that he knows this is going to escalate into war, that it's threatening that direction. He knows that this is making China very, very, very angry because China sees Taiwan as part of its sovereign territory, and still his position is the opposite of his position around Ukraine. I mean, to me, there's no more cognitive dissonance here, and it just shows how deep this blind spot can be, that you have two parallel processes happening that have very deep connections to each other, Ukraine and Taiwan, right? One to provoke Russia, one to provoke China. And even though the China situation is even more dangerous, in my opinion, and also even more of a violation of sovereignty, because you don't even have the veneer of Ukraine being a sovereign country like you do with, as opposed to Taiwan. Those things are different, right? Taiwan is not a sovereign country, but Ukraine is. And so you don't even have the veneer that Ukraine has to shield it, at least in the mainstream discourse, even if we know better. But still, Mearsheimer is saying that, well, this threatens war, but the U.S. needs to defend Taiwan, and they're doing it so passionately. And now I want you to see how this interviewer reacts, because I think it's a good question. I think it's a good way to segue.
I think viewers or listeners might be surprised to hear you on that, because in a sense it's the opposite of your view of the Russia question, that even though China is a regional hegemon, Taiwan is, whether they consider it part of Greater China or whether it's just too close to have as allied with a foreign power, there is a parallel to Ukraine and Russia. But in that example, you think it would be it is in the strategic interests of the US to actually send forces, risk a greater escalation, and actually go to war if necessary to defend Taiwan.
Yeah, I think the situation with China is a lot like the situation with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I believe the United States had a deep-seated interest in preventing the Soviet Union from dominating all of Europe and dominating all of Asia.
So there you go. Deflection, right? He's asking about, well, your position is contradictory to what you're saying with Russia. Now he's talking about the Soviet Union. So let's continue.
For sure. The Soviet Union was a peer competitor of the United States. And I think the United States has a vested interest in making sure that it is the only regional hegemon of the planet, and that the Soviet Union not dominate Europe. With regard to Russia today, as I said earlier, Russia is by far the weakest of the three great powers. It is no threat to dominate all of Europe or Asia. And therefore, the United States doesn't have to pay much attention to Russia. China, on the other hand, is a peer competitor. It's not a regional hegemon yet. What the United States has to do, in my opinion, is prevent it from becoming a regional hegemon.
So, I mean, there you have it. That's the point I wanted to make, and he just says it plainly to you. Russia is weak. China is not weak. The United States should focus its energy on provoking China, encircling China, getting into a new Cold War with China, defending Taiwan, quote unquote, aka violating China's sovereignty over Taiwan in order to weaken China, right? Really, what Mearsheimer is saying is that the U.S. is in the wrong war. It shouldn't be in a proxy war with Russia because Russia is weak. It should, and I I actually disagree with that. I think Russia is actually much stronger. It would be doing performing much differently in this conflict in Ukraine if it were quote unquote weak. But the point is that it's not a quote unquote pure competitor. And I will say that if we were to reframe this from this kind of pure competitor mentality where like China and the United States are operating on level planes and that they have very similar aims and motives, and that China is just at equal status when it comes to these things. And if we were to reframe it to what the reality is, which is that China actually is a different model, different economic model, a different political model, a different way of cooperating with nations around the world, a different growth model, right? Socialism with Chinese characteristics, if we look at all that it's achieved, and now it's moving into this position where it's a leader in a multipolar world, then yeah, it does represent an existential so-called quote unquote threat to the US's hegemony and its power and its domination and its ability to reproduce the interests of its tiny elite. Yeah, we can say that's the case. But here, John Mearsheimer is not saying that. He's just promoting wedge theory as a neoliberal and a neocon, saying that the point should be to weaken Russia. To weaken China using Russia. And now I'm going to show you, this is not a fringe position. Actually, I would argue that this position is essentially the mainstream position among the so-called GOP, right? Among the so-called China hawks, right? This is the position of a lot of different forces in the United States, and it has been for quite a long time, but no more significant than now, since the conflict between Russia and China, or the conflict between the United States toward Russia and China, has never been hotter. So here you have, even today you have Josh Hawley, U.S. Senator Josh Hawley. You all remember him. He's a notorious China hawk, saying that Taiwan is more important than Ukraine. So Mearsheimer mirrors Josh Hawley, who's saying that arms deliveries should be going to Taipei, to Taiwan, not Ukraine. So here's RT's report on this. He said that Taiwan is more important to U.S. national interests and that Washington's aid money for Kiev would be better spent at home. But really what he's saying is that it would be better sent to Taiwan, and that Ukraine's military, bolstering it with armed stockpiles, is neglecting our vital security interests in Asia, and that he contended that the outflow of weapons should immediately be diverted. So first he's saying, oh, it should help. We should use money to help people at home. And then he's saying send the weapons to Taiwan instead, right? Because arming Taiwan would make it extremely difficult if China were to launch a hypothetical military assault on the island. Regardless of the weapon source, if both Taiwan and Ukraine need them, they should go to Taiwan first, Hawley said, suggesting Germany or other NATO allies focus on supplying Ukraine instead. So there you have it. I mean, you have this as a mainstream position. This isn't Mearsheimer being some kind of how should I say? He's not being a hold on. Oh, there you go. He's not being some kind of contrarian here, right? He is literally just articulating the situation. Let me see if there's anything left to play here. There might not be anything. Let me see. Let's see what else is left here.
And the problem that we face is that Taiwan is of enormous strategic importance to us. We have a deep-seated interest in defending Taiwan for strategic reasons. And the Chinese, on the other hand, again, view this as sacred territory. And this is what makes this such a dangerous situation. But I think about China much differently than I think about Russia.
So, in fact...
So that's it. I mean, I don't have to play any more of that because that's the point I wanted to make, is that there is a dangerous trend going on right now, a really dangerous trend going on in the United States, in the collective West, really, where you have people, because this war in Ukraine is becoming a quagmire, because it's becoming kind of untenable for the ruling class to manage, you have a situation where I mean, this isn't going well, right? You already have so many instances of this. So many, and I'm going to close just with just some brief updates because they really do support this point. So John Mearsheimer is saying that we need to really, what he's doing is he's forwarding a military doctrine. He's saying that actually where the focus needs to be is on Taiwan and not China. He didn't say one China policy once. He didn't say one China principle at all. He didn't talk about the United States' agreements or the UN resolution, which codifies the fact that Taiwan is part of China. He didn't bring up any of that because he is forwarding a military doctrine saying that actually what the United States is doing is incorrect. It needs to be allying itself with Russia. It needs to be stopping its conflict with Russia and moving against China. And so I think, a big reason why this is the case, a huge reason why this is the case, is because you already have a situation with the Ukraine conflict. It was always a losing battle, right? The United States is not prepared to fight either of these countries, really. It's not really prepared to do so, and it's already shown this through what's happening now, where you have the Pentagon saying it's running out of money for Ukraine. You have NATO saying it's running out of weapons, that Kiev is going to be reportedly left without new American shells and improved howitzers because of the budget deal. There's a lot of conflict around it. But you do also have, it's not just about the budget. It's not just about the fact that NATO is running out of weapons, but it's also the fact of time. There's time not on the side of Ukraine, right? Winter is here. You have Russia still conducting these missile strikes, which are pulverizing Kiev's power grid. Now, Kiev is doing very dangerous things like firing missiles on Russia's territory, using certain drone technology on Russia's territory. A very big mistake, because that means Russia is going to feel compelled to escalate even further. And we know that hundreds of thousands of Russian troops are on the way to the front lines very soon. So time is not on their side. And you also have the situation that this economic war is very counterproductive, and it's only escalating. You have now an oil price cap at $60 a barrel being enforced by the European Union and the United States, trying to starve Russia, trying to get rid of third parties from being able to use shipping and insurance and all of that, all dominated by U.S. and Western corporations, trying to starve Russia even further by eliminating the possibility of Russia selling its oil to third parties. And Russia is, of course, going to retaliate, and it's going to probably cut oil production. And that is only going to raise prices and put the hurt further on the U.S. and Western political economy, on the global economy, on the capitalist economy. This is not looking good. So really what I'm showing you now are just brief snippets of how things aren't going well in Ukraine. And you have now Macron. This isn't the first time he's done this, but Russia has said that they are going to consider. You have Emmanuel Macron saying that despite all of the United States, we love you, France, we love you. France is now saying, and Germany has said this too, that NATO has to prepare security guarantees for Russia now around neutrality with NATO and Ukraine and other things, because this war is not going the way that the United States, the way that they would want it to go. It's not going in the direction they want it to go. It's going to be it is a quagmire. It's only going to get worse. And so you have a lot of different things happening. You still have escalations toward Russia, but you also have this growing realization that this isn't working. And so this contradiction is going to come to a head. There's going to be some shift in policy, whether voices like Macron's are once again kind of pushed down and repressed. And guess what? Macron, he's not going to fight it, because what has the European Union done but basically bow down to the United States and say, yes, we'll fight your war for you, and we'll do way more than even what you're willing to do to fight this war, right? This has been the case since the very beginning of this thing, and it's only going to continue to be the case unless the United States decides that this actually has to cool off for at least a little bit, and that there is a move towards some kind of security guarantee, some kind of negotiations. I don't see that coming down the road. I don't see Ukraine behaving in a way that will allow that to happen. I also don't see the EU having any kind of spine to push that to happen. So essentially, what we have here is John Mearsheimer saying that Taiwan is of real security in strategic interest to the United States, not Ukraine. But you really have the military-industrial complex saying differently. While they're running out of weapons and they can't supply Ukraine in the way that they have been for so long now since the beginning of this conflict, they still want to do it. And they also want to do Taiwan too. Now, Taiwan is a different kind of situation. And I think this is what John Mearsheimer is hinting at, is that he is probably hoping, along with probably the tiny minority of people like him, they are probably hoping that they can somehow get into some more manageable, slower, kind of slow rolling conflict with China that's been happening since 2012, right? This pivot to Asia, slowly build up the defenses of Taiwan so that when war does break out, when the U.S. decides it's time to wage war there, that Taiwan is prepared. That's probably in Mearsheimer's mind what he's thinking, because guess what? He's an international relations analyst. He was trained at the Council on Foreign Relations. These people are just war hawks, and I don't care if he had one correct position on Ukraine. The fact of the matter is that he's still speaking through the state, the military state apparatus. That's what he's doing, and he's doing it because it's profitable for them, and he's just giving different business advice. And so here, what you have is a situation where people like Mearsheimer, they have these huge blind spots because they're not actually anti-war. They're not anti-capitalist. They're not anti-neoliberal. They're not anti-neocon. They're not anti-anything. They are simply all about trying to find the correct position for the elite, to put them in the position to wage the kind of wars that are effective. And Mearsheimer, I think, is highly mistaken here, because he thinks what's more effective is a war with China over time at some point in the future, while Russia could be an ally. I think that for someone who's considered to be so smart, that couldn't be any further from the truth, right? There's nothing further from the truth than the fact that, one, Russia's not going to be your ally now. Look at all that's happened. There's no reversing course here. You've staged nuclear weapons. There's already been false flags. The Nord Stream pipelines are destroyed. The sanctions are there, and the EU and the US have no political will to withdraw those economic sanctions unless there's some kind of full course reversal in policy. Can you imagine Russia saying, well, we're just your allies now? But that's what Mearsheimer wants to happen, and it's a fantasy. And not only that, but it's also a fantasy to think that you can break up Russia and China at the moment. These two countries not only have deep political and military security interests together, fighting what is a global hegemon, the United States, trying to destroy their societies and their ways of life, but you also have the fact that these two countries have so much more in common as Asian countries, as countries that that share borders, that share a whole Eurasian region that they want to integrate. They have similar visions for that. There's just no reason for these two countries to really ever fight again, short of some kind of regime change scenario. And that's why the warmongering is so hot right now. But John Mearsheimer can't see it. And so, that's why he talks the way he does. That's why he doesn't say one China principle. He doesn't talk about peace in the same way. He doesn't talk about negotiations between China and the United States. China is the socialist boogeyman. China is the real so-called quote-unquote threat, and it must be destroyed accordingly. And so we have to be very careful about any of these forces out there who talk like this, right? Anyone who claims to be a friend of peace when it comes to Russia, but not the same when it comes to China. that kind of inconsistency is not just incorrect, it is patently dangerous, and we need to call it out, and we need to point it out whenever it emerges, because it's way more dangerous than the neocons and the hawks and all of those who will show you and tell you right to your face that both China and Russia are the enemies. At the very least, we can forge strategic unity based on opposition to that.